Oh, hello there. I'm Bilchen, a cute bear. In this class, I'll read to all of you. Chapter 4 of The Great Gatsby.
Ass.
Oh. The Great Gatsby. I've Scott Fitzgerald. Chapter 4. On Sunday morning, while church bells rang in the village's longshore, the world and its mistress returned to Gatsby's house and twinkled hilariously on his lawn. "He's a bootlegger," said the young ladies, moving somewhere between his cocktails and his flowers. One time he killed a man who had found out that he was nephew to von Hindenburg and second cousin to the devil. Reach me a rose. Annie. Once I wrote down on the empty spaces of a timetable the names of those who came to Gatsby's house that summer. It is an old timetable now, disintegrating at its folds, and headed this schedule in effect July 5th, 1922, but I can still read the grey names, and they will give you a better impression than my generalities of those who accepted Gatsby's hospitality and paid him the subtle tribute of knowing nothing whatever about him. From Eastig. Then came the Chester Bickers and the Leaches, and a man named Bunsen, whom I know at Yale, and Dr. Webster Sivett, who was drowned last summer up in Maine, and the Hornbeams and the Woolly Voltaires, and a whole clan named Blackback, who always gathered in a corner and flipped up their noses like goats that he saw over. Came now, and the Ismays and the Christies, or rather Hubert Arbol and Mr. Christie's wife, and Edgar Beaver, who's here, they say. 10 got on white one winter afternoon for no good reason at all. Clarence and it was from Eastig. As I remember, he came only once, in white knickerbockers, and had a fight with a bum named Ditty in the garden. From farther out on the island came the Chiddles and the Woe. Oh. The Traders, and the Stonewall Jacks and Abrahams of Georgia, and the Fishyards and the Ruppy Snells. Snow was there 3 days before he went to the penitentiary, so drunk out on the gravel drive that Mice Ulysses Sweat's automobile ran over his right hand. The Denseys came too, and the Spee, Whitebait, who was well over 60, and Morris a Flink, and the Hammerheads, and Billiga the tobacco importer, and Billiga's Gulls, from Westig. Came the Poles and the Mulradys, and Cecil Roebuck and Cecil Skern and Gilliga, State Senator and Newton Orchid, who controlled films par excellence and a cast-and Clyde Coyne and Donna Schwartz, the son, and Arthur McCarthy, all connected with the movies in one way or another, and the Callops and the Bimbergs, and Joe Muldoon, brother to that Muldoon who afterwards strangled his wife. Tough fun to know the promoter came there, and Idle Girls, and James B. Watcott, Ferret and the De Jongs, and Ernest Liliathy came to gamble, and when Ferret wandered into the garden, it meant he was cleaned out, and associated traction would have to fluctuate profitably next day. A man named Cup Springer was there so often that he became known as the board eat out if he had any other home. Oh. Theatrical people there were Gus Wees and Horace O'Donovan and Lester Meyer and George Duckweed, and Francis Bull, also from New York were the Cromes and the Backisons and the Denekers and Russell Betty and the Corrigans and the Culhers and the Joes and the Scullys and the Stubby Belcher and the Smirks and the Young Quins. Divorced now, and Henry O'Palmetto, who killed himself by jumping in front of a subway train in Times Square. Benny McClanahan arrived always with 4 girls. They were never quite the same ones in physical person, but they were so identical one with another that it inevitably seemed they had been there before. I have forgotten their name is Jacqueline, I think, or else Consuela, or Buria or Judy or June, and their last names were either the melodious names of flowers and months or the sterner ones of the great American capitalist whose cousins, if pressed, they would confess themselves to be. In addition to all these, I can remember that Faustino O'Brien came there at least once in the Baedeker Gulls, and young Brewer who had his nose shot off in the war, and Mr. Albrook's Berger and Miss Haug, his Fink, and Order de Fitzpeters and Mr. Pigerit, once head of the American Legion, and Miss Claudia Hip, with a man reputed to be her chauffeur and a prince of something whom we called Duke, and whose name, if I ever knew it, I have forgotten. All these people came to Gatsby's house in the summer. At 9 o'clock one morning late in July, Gatsby's gorgeous gull lurched up the rocky drive to my door and gave out a burst of melody from its three-noted horn. It was the first time he had called on me, though I had gone to 2 of his parties mounted in his hydroplane, and at his urgent invitation made frequent use of his speech. Good morning, old sport. He was balancing himself on the dashboard of his car with that resourcefulness of movement that is so peculiarly American, that comes, I suppose, with the absence of lifting work in youth, and even more with the formless grace of our nervous sporty games. This quality was continually breaking through his punctilious manner. In the shape of restlessness, he was never quite still. There was always a tapping foot somewhere, or the impatient opening and closing of a hand heater. Me looking with admiration at his car. It's pretty, isn't it, old sport? He jumped off to give me a better view. I'd seen it. Everybody had seen it. It was a rich cream colour, bright with nickel, swollen here and there in its monstrous length, with triumphant hat boxes and supper boxes and toolboxes, and terraced with a labyrinth of windshields that mirrored a dozen suns. Titting down behind many layers of glass in a sort of green leather conservatory, we started to town. I had talked with him perhaps half a dozen times in the past month, and found, to my disappointment, that he had little to say. So my first impression that he was a person of some undefined consequence had gradually faded, and he had become simply the proprietor of an elaborate roadhouse next door. And then came that disconcerting ride. We hadn't reached Westig village before Gatsby began leaving his elegant sentences unfinished and slapping himself indecisively on the knee of his caramel-coloured suit. Look here, old sport, he broke out surprisingly. What's your opinion of me? A little overwhelmed, I began the generalised evasions which that question deserves. Well, I'm going to tell you something about my life, he interrupted. So he was aware of the bizarre accusations that fluffered conversation in his pause. I'll tell you God's truth. His right hand suddenly ordered divine retribution to stand. I am the son of some wealthy people in the Middle West, old it. I was brought up in America but educated at Oxford because all my ancestors have been educated there for many years. He looked at me sideways, and I knew why Jordan Baker had believed he was lying. He hurried the phrase educated at Oxford, or swallowed it, or choked on it as though it had bothered him before, and with this doubt his whole statement fell to pieces, and I wondered if there wasn't something a little sinister about him. After all, what part of the Middle West? I inquired casually. His voice was solemn, as if the memory of that sudden extinction of a clan still haunted him. For a moment I suspected that he was pulling my leg, but a glance at him convinced me otherwise. After that I lived like a young Raja in all the capitals of Europe: Paris, Venice, Roma, collecting jewels, chiefly rubies, hunting big game, painting a little, things for myself only, with an effort. I managed to restrain my incredulous laughter. The very phrases were worn so threadbare that they evoked no image except that of a turban character leaking sawdust out every pore as he pursued a tiger through the Bois de Boulogne. Then came the war. Old sport. It was a great relief, and I tried very hard to die, but I seemed to bear an enchanted life. I accepted it. Commissioning as first lieutenant when it began. In the Argonne first I took the remains of my machine gun battalion so far forward that there was a half-mile gap. On either side of us where the infantry couldn't advance. We stayed there 2 days and 2 nights, 130 men with 16 Lewis guns. And when the infantry came up, at last they found the insignia of 3 German divisions among the piles of dead. I was promoted to be a major. And every Allied government gave me a decoration of in Montenegro, Little Montenegro. He lifted up the words and nodded at them with his smile. The smile comprehended Montenegro's troubled history and sympathized with the brave struggles of the Montenegrin people. It appreciated fully the chain of national circumstances which had elicited this tribute from Montenegro's warm little heart. My incredulity was submerged in fascination now. It was like skimming hastily through a dozen magazines. He reached in his pocket, and a piece of metal slung on a ribbon fell into my palm. To my astonishment, the thing had an authentic look. Ordered in below ran the secular legend, Montenegro. Major J. Gatsby, I read, here's another thing I always carry. A souvenir of Oxford days. It was a photograph of half a dozen young men in blazers loafing in an archway through which were visible a host of spires. There was Gatsby, looking a little, not much, Andrew with a cricket bat in his hand. Then it was all true. I saw the skins of tigers flaming. In his palace on the Grand Canal, I saw him opening a chest of ruby seas with their crimson lighted depths, the gnawings of his broken heart. I'm going to make a big request of you today, he said, pocketing his souvenirs with satisfaction, so I thought you ought to know something about me. I didn't want you to think I was just some nobody. You see, I usually find myself among strangers because I drift here and there trying to forget the sad things that happened to me. He hesitated. No, this afternoon. No, old sport, I'm not. I hadn't the faintest idea what this matter was, but I was more annoyed than interested. I hadn't asked Jordan to tea in order to discuss Mr. J. Gatsby. I was sure that the quest would be something utterly fantastic, and for a moment I was sorry-eyed. Ever set foot upon his overpopulated lawn. He wouldn't say another word. His correctness grew on him as we neared the city. We passed Port Roosevelt, where there was a glimpse of red-bolted ocean-going ships, and sped along a cobbled slum lined with the dark, undeserted saloons of the faded gold 1900s. Then the valley of ashes opened out on both sides of us, and I had a glimpse of mice was straining at the garage pump with panting vitality as we went by. With fenders spread like wings, we scattered light through half a story and a half for. As we trusted among the pillars of the elevated, I heard the familiar jug-spat of a motorcycle, and a frantic policeman rode alongside. All right, old sport, called Gatsby. We slowed down. Taking a white card from his wallet, he waved it before the man's eyes. Right you are, agreed the policeman, tipping his. Oh, no, you next time, Mr. Gatsby. What was that? I inquired. I was able to do the commissioner a favour once over the great bridge, with the sunlight through the girders making a constant flicker up on the moving cars, with the city rising up across the river in white heaps, and Shkulam Sobot with a wish out of non-olfactory money. The city scene from the Queensborough Bridge is always the city scene for the first time in its first wild promise of all the mystery and the beauty in the world. Dead men passed us in a hearse heaped with blooms, followed by 2 carriages with drawn blinds, and by more cheerful carriages for friends. The friends looked out at us with the tragic eyes and short upper lips of southeastern Europe, and I was glad that the sight of Gatsby's splendid car was included in their sombre holiday. As we crossed Blackwell's Island, a limousine passed us, driven by a white chauffeur in which sat 3 modish Negroes, 2 bucks and a girl. I laughed aloud as the yolks of their eyeballs rolled toward us in haughty rivalry. Anything can happen now that we've slid over this bridge, I thought. Even Gatsby could happen without any particular wonder. Roaring noon. In a wolf band. 32nd Street Cellar, I met Gatsby for lunch, blinking away the brightness of the street outside. My eyes picked him out obscurely in the anteroom, talking to other man. Where's it? Caraway, this is my friend Mr. Small. Flat-nosed, he raised his large head and regarded me with 2 fine growths of hair, which luxuriated in either nostril. After a moment I discovered his tiny eyes in the half-darkness. So I took one look at him, said Mr. Walsham, shaking my hand earnestly. What? I inquired politely, but evidently he was not addressing me, for he dropped my hand and covered Gatsby with his expressive nose. I handed the money to Caspo and I said, "All right, Caspo." Gatsby took an arm of each of us and moved forward into the restaurant, whereupon Mr. Walsham swallowed a new sentence he was starting and lapsed into a somnambulatory abstraction. "Hibles?" asked the head waiter. "This is a nice restaurant here," said Mr. Walsham, looking at the Presbyterian imps on the ceiling. "Yes, Hibles," agreed Gatsby. And then to Mr. Walsham, "Hot and Smalley's," said Mr. Walsham. "What place is that?" I asked. "The old Metropole," brooded Mr. Walsham gloomily. "Filled with faces dead and gone. Filled with friends gone now forever. I can't forget so long as I lie the night they shot Rosie Rosenthal there." It was 6 of us at the table, and Rosie had eaten and drunk a lot all evening. When it was almost morning, the waiter came up to him with a funny look and says somebody wants to speak to him outside. "All right," says Rosie, and begins to get up, and I pulled him down in his chair. "Let the bastards come in here if they want you, Rosie, but don't you, so help me." It was 4 o'clock. "In the morning then, did he go?" I asked innocently. "Sure he went." Was to Walsham's nose flashed at me indignantly. He turned around in the door and says, "Didn't let that waiter take away my coffee." Then he went out on the sidewalk. 4 of them were electrocuted, I said, remembering 5 with bigger. His nostrils turned to me in an interested way. The juxtaposition of these 2 remarks was startling. Gatsby answered for me. "Oh no," he exclaimed. "Bro." Mr. Walsham seemed disappointed. "This is just a friend." "I beg your pardon," said Mr. Walsham, as the Coon hash arrived, and Mr. Walsham, forgetting the more sentimental atmosphere of the old Metropole, began to eat with ferocious delicacy. His eyes, meanwhile, roved very slowly all around the room, completed the act by turning to inspect the people directly behind. I think that, except for my presence, he would have taken one short glance beneath our on table. "Look here, old sport," said Gatsby, leaning toward me. There was the smile again, but this time I held out against it. "I don't like mysteries," I answered, "and I don't understand why you won't come out frankly and tell me what you want." "Oh, it's nothing underhand," he assured me. "Miss Baker's a great sportswoman, you know." Suddenly he looked at his watch, jumped up, and hurried from the room, leaving me with Mr. Walsham at the table. "He has to telephone," said Mr. Walsham, following him with his eyes. "Fine fellow, isn't he? He went to Oxford College in England." "Have you known Gatsby for a long time?" I inquired. "Several years," he answered in a gratified way. "I made the pleasure of his acquaintance just after the war, but I know I had discovered a man of fine breeding after I talked with him an hour. I said to myself, there's the kind of man you'd like to take home and introduce to your mother and sister." He paused. I hadn't been looking at them, but I did now. They were composed of oddly familiar pieces of ivory, finest specimens of human molars. He informed me. Well, I inspected them. He flipped his sleeves up under his coat. Gatsby's very careful about women when the subject of this instinctive trust returned to the table and set down. Mr. Wolfsham drank his coffee with a jerk and got to his feet. I have enjoyed my lunch, he said. Don't hurry, Mayor, said Gatsby without enthusiasm. Mr. Wolfsham raised his hand in a sort of benediction. You're very polite, but I belong to another generation, he announced solemnly. You sit here and discuss your sports and your young ladies, and he supplied an imaginary noun with another wave of his hand. As for me, I am 50 years old, as he shook hands and turned away. His tragic nose was trembling. I wondered if I had said anything to offend him. He becomes very sentimental sometimes, explained Gatsby. This is one of his sentimental days. Who is he in hell? Mayor Wolfsham. No. He's a gambler. Gatsby hesitated, then added, Clay fixed the world's series. I repeated. The idea staggered me. I remembered, of course, that the World Series had been fixed in 1919, but if I had thought of it at all, I would have thought of it as a thing that merely happened. The end of some inevitable chain. It never occurred to me that one man could start to play with the faith of 15 million people with the single-mindedness of a burglar blowing a safe. How did he happen to do that? I asked after a minute. They can't get him bold sport. I insisted on paying the check. As the waiter brought my change, I caught sight of Tom Beacon and across the crowded room. Come along with me for a minute, I said when he saw us. Tom jumped up and took half a dozen steps in our direction. Where have you been? He demanded eagerly. This is Mr. Gatsby, Mr. They shook hands briefly, and a strained, unfamiliar look of embarrassment came over Gatsby's face. Has you been, and how? Demanded Tom of me. I've been having lunch with Mr. I turned toward Mr. Gatsby, but he was no longer there. One October day in 1917, said Jordan Baker. That afternoon I was walking along from one place to another, half on the sidewalks and half on the lawns. I was happier on the lawns because I had on shoes from England, with rubber knobs on the soles that bit into the soft ground. I had on a new plaid skirt also that blew a little in the wind, and whenever this happened, the red, white and blue banners in front of all the houses stretched out stiff and said tit-tit-tit-tit in a disapproving way. The largest of the banners and the largest of the lawns belonged to Daisy Frey's house. She was just 18, 2 years older than me, and by far the most popular of all the young girls in Louisville. She dressed in white and had a little white rooster, and all day long the telephone rang in her house, and excited young officers from Camp Taylor demanded the privilege of monopolizing her that night. Anyways, when I came opposite her house that morning, her white rooster was beside the curl, and she was sitting in it with a lieutenant I had never seen before. They were so engrossed in each other that she didn't see me until I was 5 feet away. Hello, Jordan, she called unexpectedly. I was flattered that she wanted to speak to me because of all the older girls I admired her most. She asked me if I was going to the Red Cross to make bandages. I was. Well then, would I tell them that she couldn't come that day? The officer looked at Daisy while she was speaking in a way that every young girl wants to. We looked at some time, and because it seemed romantic to me, I have remembered the incident ever since. His name was J. Gatsby, and I didn't lay eyes on him again for over 4 years, even after I'd met him on Long Island. I didn't realize it was the same man. That was 1917. By the next Here I had a feeble myself, and I began to play in tournaments. So I didn't see Daisy very often. She went with a slightly older Crodar, and she went with anyone at all. Wild rumours were circulating about her how her mother had found her packing her bag one winter night to go to New York and say goodbye to a soldier who was going overseas. She was effectually prevented, but she wasn't on speaking terms with her family for several weeks. After that, she didn't play around with the soldiers anymore, but only with a few flat-footed, short-sighted young men in town who couldn't get into the army at all. By the next autumn, she was gay again, gay as ever. She headed but after the armistice, and in February she was presumably engaged to a man from New Orleans. In June she married Tom Buchanan of Chicago, with more pomp and circumstance than Louisa ever knew before. He came down with 100 people and 4 private cars and hired a whole floor of the Mobile Hotel, and the day before the wedding he gave her a string of pearls valued at $350,000. I was a bridesmaid. I came into her room half an hour before the bridal dinner and found her lying on her bed as lovely as the June night in her flowery dress on, as drunk as a monkey. She had a bottle of Southern in one hand and a letter in the other. "Congratulate me," she muttered. "Never had a drink before. What's the matter?" I was scared, I can tell you. I'd never seen a girl like that before. He agrees. She groped around in a wastebasket she had with her on the bed and pulled out the string of pearls. "Take him downstairs and give him back to whoever they belong to. Tell him old Daisy's changed her mind." Say she began to cried and cried. I rushed out and found her mother's maid, and we locked the door and got her into a cold bath. She wouldn't let go of the letter. She took it into the tub with her and squeezed it up in a wet ball and only let me leave it in the soup dish one. She saw that it was coming to pieces like so, but she didn't say another word. We gave her spirits of ammonia and put ice on her forehead and hooked her back into her dress, and half an hour later, when we walked out of the room, the pearls were around her neck and the incident was over. Next day at 5 o'clock she married Tom Buchanan without so much as a shiver and started off on a 3-month trip to the south. Teased. I saw them in Santa Barbara when they came back, and I thought I'd never seen a girl so mad about her husband. If he left the room for a minute, she'd look around uneasily and say, "Where's Tom gone?" and wear the most abstracted expression until she saw him coming in the door. She used to sit on the sand with his head in her lap by the hour, rubbing her fingers over his eyes and looking at him with unfathomable delight. It was touching to see them two. It made you laugh in a hushed, fascinated way. That was in August, a week after I left Santa Barbara. Tom ran into a wagon on the Ventura Road one night and ripped it front wheel off his car. The girl who was with him got into the papers too because her arm was broken. She was one of the chambermaids in the Santa Barbara hotel. The next April, Daisy had her little girl and they went to France for a year. I saw them one spring in Cannes and later in Deauville, and then I came back to Chicago to settle down. Daisy was popular in Chicago, as you know. They moved with a fast crowd, all of them young and rich and wild, but she came out with an absolutely perfect reputation. Perhaps because she doesn't drink. It's a great advantage not to drink among hard-drinking people. You can hold your tongue and moreover, you can time any little irregularity of your own so that everybody else is so blind that they don't see or care. Well, about 6 weeks ago, she heard the name Gatsby for the first time in years. It was when I asked you, do you remember, if you knew Gatsby in Westig? After you had gone home, she came into my room and woke me up and said, "What, Gatsby?" And when I described him, he was half asleep, said in the strangest voice that it must be the man she used to know. A Wasn't until then that I connected this Gatsby with the officer in her white car. When Jordan Baker had finished telling all this, we had left the plaza for half an hour and were driving in a Victoria through Central Park. The sun had gone down behind the tall apartments of the movie stars in the West 50s, and the clear voices of children, already gathered like crickets on the grass, rose through the hot twilight. And the shake of Irby, "Your life belongs to me." It was a strange coincidence, I said. Then it had not been merely the stars to which he had aspired on that June night. He came alive to me, delivered suddenly from the womb of his purposeless splendour. He wants to know, continued Jordan. The modesty of the dement shook me. He had waited 5 years and bought a mansion where he dispensed delight to Cashel Mott so that he could come over a Sam afternoon to a stranger's garden. He's afraid he's waited so long. He thought you might be offended. You see, something worried me. He wants her to see his house, she explained. I think he have expected her to wander into one of his parties some night, went on Jordan, but she never did. Then he began asking people casually if they knew her, and I was the first one he found. It was that night he sent for me at his dance, and you should have heard the elaborate way he worked up to it. Of course, I immediately suggested a luncheon in New York, and I thought he'd go mad. I don't want to do anything out of the way, he kept saying. When I said you were a particular friend of Tom's, he started to abandon the whole idea. He doesn't know very much about Tom. It was dark now, and as we dipped under a little bridge, I put my arm around Jordan's golden shoulder and drew her toward me and asked her to dinner. Suddenly, I wasn't thinking of Daisy and Gatsby anymore, but of this clean, hard, limited person who dealt in universal skepticism. And he leaned back gently just within the circle of my arm. A phrase began to beat in my ears with a sort of heady excitement. There are only the pursuit, the pursuing, the busy, and Daisy ought to have something in her life, murmured Jordan to me. She's not to know about it. Gatsby doesn't want her to know. We passed a barrier of dark trees, and then the fade of 59th Street, a block of delicate pale light, beamed down into the park. Unlike Gatsby and Tom Buchanan, I had no gold whose disembodied face floated along the dark cornice and blinding signs, and so I dropped the goal beside me, tightening my arms. Her one scornful mouth smiled, and so I drew her up again closer, this time to my face. To be continued.